Welcome Effy, welcome Leonard to Meraki TV. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Tell us firstly about this amazing project, Greek Australians in Their Own Image.
Well, it's hard to believe, but we actually started this in the early 80s. I was doing a postgrad in photography, and I was looking for something to photograph, and I decided to focus on my family. And the lecturers at the time were all very supportive and encouraging of that work. And then in 1983, my father died, and that when you're focusing on your family and the head of the family is not there, that really propelled me to actually document it even more than I had been. So it became a bit of an obsession, I suppose. And I had already met Leonard, and he was researching. He was doing a thesis for Sydney University on the gold rushes. And he told me that all these Greeks that were working out of Hill End and in the Bathurst area back then. So that was pretty inspiring, so we decided to work together.
And what a beautiful collaboration it was. So you traced it back all the way back. It wasn't just the 50s rush or the 60s wave of immigration. You traced it back to the gold rush.
Yeah, look, it wasn't just the 50s. There were other individuals who were undertaking research. For instance, Hugh Gilchrist, most people would be aware of his work, and he took it right back to the initial convicts that arrived out here, the Greek convicts in 1829. However, I will say we've been able to uncover potentially Australia's first Greek, who was born in this country in 1814 when it was still a colony. His mother was an Indigenous Australian, and his father appears to have been a Greek sailor, and his name was Yorgos Papas.
Oh, wow.
So we've taken a look at Greeks from that period, 1814, right through to the present time, and we've interacted with contemporary Greeks or descendants of very early Greeks. So we've tried to cover a very broad gambit, but it doesn't stop there. We also take a look at the Greek-Australian presence overseas, because Greeks, it's a diaspora. They've been migrating from Greece ever since at least the Middle Bronze Age, and it's continued in the modern era. So we've been looking at the Greek-Australian presence overseas and seeing what influences they've had in their new countries.
Oh, wow. And is there a similar, what are the similarities that you found worldwide? Like they settle in a new place. Is it pretty much the same process that happens? They build their church, they build their community, they try and preserve their language, or is it different, or does it happen differently in different parts of the globe?
There are major differences. What you're talking about is when there is a large wave of Greeks who migrate, and then they establish a church, they establish a community within the host society to attempt to retain their identity. But in countries where there are no large waves going to them, you have individuals who will come across and attempt to establish themselves. One of the things that all of these individuals have in common is they don't simply travel with their suitcases. They also travel with their experiences which they've gathered and their ideas. And so the Greek diaspora, to a large extent, is a vehicle, not only taking the physical wherewithal that individuals take with them to another country, but also what they have in their heads. And that's how they inject themselves into the new host society, because they can see the lay of the land very differently. There was one individual who we interviewed way back in the late 80s in Tasmania, and he indicated to us quite clearly, when I came out here, I was like a fly in milk. Everyone could see us. And not everybody wanted us to be here, but I could see things that the locals couldn't see. So I was able to develop an enterprise, and he developed an engineering enterprise, and they built velodromes, they built ferries, a variety of things. And so he had those experiences, he applied them in a new land, and he made a life for himself. And that's something which appears to be in common, no matter where you're looking, the United States, South Africa, Central Europe. That's what Greeks take with them, the ideas, and that's what they inject into the new host societies.
Wow, an interesting perspective. Going back to the project of Greek Australians in Their Own Image, your beautiful images.
Oh, thank you.
How did you source all of those? Because Greeks are kind of clandestine, so to try and pry that out of their hands must have taken a bit of work.
Oh, well, not really. I think if you're genuine, I think that shines through. The way we collected all the information was to physically go out there. We do
it's
it
a lot of legwork.
well, before our daughter, we used to do a lot of field trips. In 1987, I think we spent 5 months of that year just driving around Australia. We did the coast road clockwise all the way around, and then later that year we went from right through to Queensland, Adelaide, up to Darwin, so we crossed through the middle, and just looking for Greeks. We'd go into the police station or the local cafe, if there was one in the particular town, finding out where the Greek people were and getting their stories. And if you've made the effort to go out there, I think people are very accommodating and appreciative that you're interested in their story. I think we've only had about 2 turnbacks where we drove, I think might have been Bombala. We drove a really long time trying to get to see this particular person, and they thought we might have been from the tax department or something like that. So there's only been a few occasions where people haven't been interested in sharing their life story with us. And we never, I just copy everything. We never keep originals. That's not part of what this project is about. Mm-hmm. It's just to document what they have. I think you've got to keep family photos with the family. That's where they belong.
Because they have a story themselves, which would change if you put it in the public sphere. So we make a copy, that goes within the public sphere, and it gathers an identity itself within that sphere, but the private meaning to the family remains because they keep the original. But I'd like to just put it within context when we were doing this work originally in the 1980s. Australia was a different place then. Sounds like a cliche, but it certainly was. The idea of multiculturalism, for instance, was really embraced. However, major collecting institutions would put out advertising, come and give us your material. Certainly some would. Most, from non-English speaking people, groups, would be the middle class providing information. But what we wanted to do was have a cross-section, not just simply those who wanted their names perpetuated. We wanted to take a look at the different stratas. And to do that, we did the opposite of what the major collecting institutions were doing. We didn't sit behind a desk, and as Effy said, we put our very strong boots on. We started going around the country. And we've been doing that ever since. And it became such that not only did we travel around Australia, but also, as I indicated earlier, overseas. Looking, always looking. But we're always guided by historical documents where Greeks potentially were or where it's been suggested that they have been. So that gives us some insight into where we should go. And we'll continue doing it until, well, our feet give up, and we are getting older. We've been doing it for 30 years. But also we've stimulated a younger generation to also take up this work via students. We used to have students who would do some research for us over at Macquarie University, for instance, and I do know of some who've taken the stimulus of doing this type of work with them to go on and do postgraduate work.
Oh, beautiful. Is there a favourite story or a favourite person in all the travels that you've done? Is there someone that stands out that will just stay with you to the day you die?
Mine is Maria from Binalong. She had this little cafe at Binalong, which is an hour out of Canberra, is it? Not far. And her husband had died, and so she was running the cafe on her own, and that was just after the GST had been introduced. So she felt like she couldn't sell this business because it wasn't profitable. The train line had stopped going there because the industry that the area had supported was no longer viable. And she talked about she came from Kalavrita. A lot of times people mention where they've come from, and it inspires you to want to visit. Now Kalavrita, you'll know the story where I can't remember the exact number, but hundreds of boys between 16 and older were killed during the war by the Germans. And so we actually went there on another field trip later on just to see her story, because she talked about walking around there looking for her father's corpse, and it was just you just can't imagine that the story just did not seem
it's not real, is
real.
It? That you're standing talking to somebody who's living a normal life who actually lived that in their time. I think that's one of the things that your images do for us lay people who open one of your books is you suddenly connect to that story there, and you just, like a photo will capture a moment in time, it'll capture the look in their eyes, it'll capture so much, and you sort of, because growing up you hear all these stories from your parents, but you're so removed from it that it's like this history lesson. And then you see that photo and you go, oh, it wasn't just my parents. Oh, that's what my mum was talking about. Oh, that's that person. And there's just something that happens inside where you just connect to everything that's been floating around in your life.
Yeah, and a lot of the stories are like that. There's when we tour the exhibition, we unpack it, and every time I spend a lot of time re-looking at it. It's like opening up your suitcase or your favourite old box with your family photographs. You spend some time and you revisit all these wonderful stories and people that we've met. So many have passed away because it has been a long time that we've been doing this. But when you've spoken to them so intimately, sometimes they tell us things that they've not told anyone before. And I don't know, it's a stranger finds something interesting in their life, and people just tell you stuff that sometimes you don't really want to know. And often we have to stop the tape, rewind it back if we have to, or have a little cry and pass the tissues, and then go on. And it's been like that for so many interviews that we've done. I don't know, people want to share something.
There's something about telling a stranger that will bring, it'll open something that, someone won't. Maybe because there's just no judgment there. Leonard, do you have a favourite story?
Oh, I do have a favourite story. And this was way back in 1990 when we were looking at Ithaca, Kythera and Castellorizo and looking at the depopulation of those islands, because they were by far, they sent the majority of early Greeks, that's pre-1940, to Australia. And yet, when we took a look at the sociological works that were published here, they were starting to look at the Greek-Australian presence, and there was a touch in regard to history, particularly through Hugh Gilchrist or Michael Tunis in South Australia. But nobody had a look at, well, what did they leave and what happened in Greece? And when you take a look at those islands at that particular stage, they had been depopulated, and they were ghost villages.
Really?
That's what they were. There were very few people living in the villages. It was sparse compared to, for instance, today, where all of those islands have had a new lease of life. Second, third or fourth generation are reclaiming lands, fixing up the houses and so on. But at that particular point in time, some 30 to 40 years after the mass migration, the final migration just after the 50s, which had been the end product of the migration from early on, that's prior to the 1940s, that had left. And we started documenting houses with abandoned houses that had photographs and letters sent back from Australia or from Canada or from the United States or from South Africa back there, and documenting. But we also came across those few who had been left behind. And on Ithaca, we were going through a particular village, Aya Saranta, I think it was.
That's right, yeah.
And we didn't realise that anybody was in the village. Effy was photographing inside of buildings, and I started to take a look at other houses. And then suddenly I heard someone talking to me in Greek. Originally I thought it was Effy. It wasn't. It was an older voice, and this elderly woman started approaching me. And I looked at her and I said to her, "Look, I can't speak Greek, and I'm an Australian." And immediately her arms went up in the air and she came towards me and embraced me and said, "I'm an Australian too." Her name was Cassie Kostopoulos, and she had been taken back to Ithaca in the early part of the 1900s. Her parents had migrated out, they made some money, they went back to Ithaca, they wanted to build a hotel in Patra. The money ran out, the parents decided, and that Cassie was born within Australia. Parents decided, let's go back. Cassie went back as a very young girl, and when they decided to come back to Australia to get more money, they left Cassie with an aunt, and she didn't want to be left there because she considered herself an Australian. She had wonderful memories of Woolloomooloo here in Sydney. She never saw her father again. He died during World War II, and she didn't see her mother again until 1962. So over 50 years elapsed before the family, or rather the mother, had come back, and she felt that she had been abandoned. And when we went inside her home, she had magazines, Woman's Day for instance, which she got from Australia. She still identified with being an Australian, not with being Greek, and she felt that her hopes had been lost to one day go back to Australia, and she was looking after an elderly husband. That was very moving for me, and that was a story which Greek Australians, as well as Australians in general, had to recognise that was part of not only Greece's history, but also Australia's history. It's an important part of migration history, it's an important part of diaspora history, but what it emphasises is the human condition, and that's what really bonds all of us, and that's why that story sticks with me. I often say to people, I'm in my 50s now, but I've actually lived more lives in those 50 years than I would have ever hoped to have undertaken if I was sitting behind a desk, because of the fact that we've been reaching out to people, and people have also been reaching back towards us and telling us their experiences, their stories, across generations. The oldest person I think we interviewed was over 100 years old. The youngest has been 11 or 12. And they do have stories to tell too. Many stories. You'd be surprised what a 11 or 12-year-old has experienced, particularly one who, for instance, is a twilight migrant, was unable to settle within Greece, was unable to settle within Australia. Those experiences, they're very interesting.
They are very interesting, those. But, you know, 11, to be having a twilight experience at 11, wow, what an early life. Like, just
very much so. And then when they get older, generally we've had situations where those interviewees, they have left their family in Greece, for instance, and returned to Australia because they believe that this is where the life should have been for them. Remember that it seems to be a cut-off stage when you're 12 or 13 where your identity is starting to develop, and you put all your eggs in one basket. You feel that you're comfortable here and you don't want to be wrenched out of that situation and sent back to Greece. And that's why many of them rebel and come back here.
Well, in the 90s, Greece was doing really well, so a lot of them, like, when I was growing up, my parents always said, you know, we'll go back to Greece one day, and that was always the threat. And I know a lot of other people were the same, that they had this intention that...
well, I think every single migrant had that intention.
But it did happen for some of them, and I think it's terrifying if you're like a young teen, because it's too late to make the early bonding friends that you would have in Greece. You don't grasp the language and the grammar. And so I remember this one young girl, she was 15 or something at the time, said, when I'm old enough, I'm going back to Australia. And we heard later that she eventually did. But, you know, people have a preference for where they want to live, if they've known both countries.
And then there's the ones who, like you said, just can't settle anywhere. Like, I know ones who have sort of, because they got wrenched at that period of time, will sort of go to Greece and stay for a couple of years, and then they come back here for a couple of years. So there's this just no settling in life, and it hinders a lot of things for them when it comes to marriage and relationships and stuff, because they'll find someone in one country, but then they want to go and the other person doesn't, or if they do, then the other person's not comfortable and they're going back. So
you're spot on there. They have dual mavlixenitia. It's black foreign land in one, it's black foreign land in the other, because they can't settle in either of them. And many returnees, those who went back to Greece, have often indicated to us that to migrate and to know two countries is a very bad thing as far as their experiences are concerned. But then on the other hand, of course, you have those who've migrated and settled and acclimatised, established themselves. And we do know of success stories where individuals have gone from not only one country, but a number of countries, seeking their fortune in a variety of areas. And so the idea of conflict of identity and where do I belong, I think to some extent have been suppressed within those individuals that felt comfortable in a variety of countries. They felt more that they belonged to the globe as such, the world, rather than a particular place or a particular nation, particular language use, for instance. They're comfortable with a variety of people, but they're rare in our experience.
So the new project, though, you're focusing on the American cafe that Greeks have taken on. Is that right? Or just Greek cafes? What's the new project?
Well, for the last 5 or so years, we've been focusing on the Greek cafe. Because we've also travelled the country, we've been documenting everything that's been of Greek, things that are Greek from way back. So we have a huge archive of images of the early cafes. Now, a Greek cafe, there used to be one in every country town. Some of them had 11 or 12 competing against each other. they're American only because of the influence came from America, and the names were like the California, the help me out, Leonard, the Busy Bee, the Astoria.
Yes.
And there's still a few remaining. There's one at Gundagai called the Niagara, and that's heritage listed. That's been Greek run for over 100 years. So we're documenting that and the milk bar.
And these institutions were powerhouses within Australian popular culture. Not only were they providing food items, but they also linked up with cinemas. It was a link between food and fantasy. And for instance, here in New South Wales until the 1950s, the second largest film distributor was a Greek. And numerous Greeks had not only cafes, but also the picture theatre. They went hand in hand. There was a symbiotic working relationship between the two. Music, for instance, what you and I take for commonplace in terms of pop music, rock music, heavy metal and so on. When rock and roll first came, it was heard on the jukeboxes before it was played in radio stations. And those jukeboxes, where were they? They were in Greek milk bars, they were in Greek cafes. Okay, so it affected also music, architecture. The type of architecture that was being utilised in these Greek cafes, Art Deco, and the Art Deco style that was quite popular was known as the American style, or the curvilinear style, the ship style. And Greeks were bringing that over from the US, specifically California, where that style was known as streamlined modern. So they were affecting architecture. They're also affecting how businesses were undertaken. For instance, in service industries, service food industries previously, the hierarchy was such that the waitress who was serving you was dressed like a servant. With the influences from the United States that were brought over by Greeks who had experienced food catering in the US or owned businesses there, suddenly it became a brand, so that the uniform was not one of an individual who would serve you, but it was representing the particular brand of the cafe. So the colours were the similar colours to the cafe. The style was a similar style to the cafe.
And the cups and everything else. It was all streamlined.
A very different approach. So as I said earlier, Greeks were not simply coming here with what they could carry, but with their ideas and their experiences. But the story doesn't stop within Australia. There was a knock-on effects to other countries, particularly with the milk bar, which was created here in Australia. The milk bar is not an American creation. They had drugstore soda parlours. They sold sodas. Milkshakes were not popular in the States until after World War II. They certainly had them. Milkshakes had been around since the 1880s in the US and even here in Australia. But in terms of popularising them, that all took place here in Australia. It was Joachim Tavlaridis. Mick Adams was his Australian name.
Wow.
He established the black and white milk bar in Sydney in Martin Place in 1932. It was so popular that the first week 27,000 people came. Within 5 years there were 4,000 milk bars around the country. Now the milk bar concept, which is focusing on one particular product, the milk shake, and it was a health drink, not the type of milkshakes we have today, which are drink the 1950s, where you put on a lot of love handles, because it was saturated with fats. Okay, that's today. But then it was a health drink. You didn't have ice cream in it. You had nuts, you had egg, you had chocolate. It was promoted as a health food. Now that concept then had a knock-on effect to New Zealand via Greeks, knock-on effect to South Africa, had a knock-on effect to Great Britain, even though it wasn't via Greeks, even though the idea was taken from Mick Adams. It was by an Australian called Hugh Dill McIntosh, and then he tried to get milk bars across to the continent. There was even an attempt to get milk bars into the United States, but that failed because the term bar in the US denotes alcohol, not light beverages. But there are milk bars in the US today. Okay, so that's a global phenomenon, which is part of the Greek cafe. The Greek cafe is an umbrella term that applies to cafes themselves, milk bars, oyster saloons, which were the precursor of the cafes. That was a British creation, but the Greeks transformed the oyster saloon. Well, the oyster saloon sold fresh oysters, bottled oysters, cooked oysters with beer, and it focused on blue-collar workers, labourers, males. The Greeks came because of their ideas of eating being a social function. They embraced the concept of bringing in families and diversifying the food items. They also brought in concepts, or rather they brought in a style of ice cream, American ice cream. In Australia here, there was an individual who we interviewed a number of years ago who remembered Australian ice cream prior to the introduction of American style ice cream by the Greeks, and he said it looked like butter, it smelt like butter, and it tasted like butter, but it was ice cream. American style ice cream was quite different. Of course, it was very sweet, it was fluffy, it was light, it tantalised you. Greeks also brought out the soda fountain, and so the oyster saloons became soda parlours or Sunday parlours,
Right.
and then they transformed into cafes.
Wow.
So a variety of ideas which they carried with them.
And they had their heyday in the 1960s, 70s, so a lot of people, young people, aren't really familiar with the vibe and what it was like. So that's why if they ever get to go to Gundagai,
Yeah, we'll definitely add that to the trip list for Meraki TV. We'd love to go down and check out that place in
Oh, that's
no,
Gundagai.
you should.
fantastic.
That would
It
be
should.
so cool.
And underneath, the town would flood, and the original store is underneath. The street's been built up,
Oh, wow.
and so underneath,
It's
it's
actually a
like
stagecoach underneath.
2 metres underneath
Wow.
the current shop.
Wow.
But the young people would be able to have some understanding or some insight into these cafes, because the descendants of the cafes, Coca-Cola, flavoured milk, whenever they go to a cinema, they will see that there is a confectionery counter there. They can buy drinks and so on. That's the relation between food and fantasy that the Greeks established here way back in the 1930s. If they listen to popular music, well, it was the Greeks that introduced contemporary popular music through the jukebox.
Wow.
So there is a link, there is some connection that they can make.
So it's going to be an exhibition, it's going to be a book. Where do we get to delve more into this beautiful topic?
Well, the exhibition has been touring since 2008, and at the end of this month it actually goes up to Redcliffe Museum, which is in Brisbane, and it'll continue touring. So it's been touring for a long time, but it's very popular. The book should be released at the end of this year.
And where will we be able to, will it go to bookstores, will it have to be online?
Both bookstores, and we'll set up a website.
Online. Well, definitely let us know when it's released.
Thank you.
And is there a link or something where you can see where the exhibition is touring at the moment? If you want to go see it, is there any way of finding out where it's at?
Well, people could go to the Australian History Museum website here at Macquarie University. That will indicate where the exhibition is going to.
Perfect. Effy, Leonard, thank you. I could keep you talking for
Love to
days,
talk.
let alone hours.
Him you could.
But thank you so much for your time today.
Thank
Thank
you.
you.
Thank you for the interest.
Thank you.